For me, success is living in complete obedience to Jesus. It's not just looking at it from what external views of success might be, but really more what an internal view of success would be.
God has given each of us special gifts, and it's our job to figure out what they are and where He would have us use them.
One has to trust God because nothing is guaranteed. Even health and the length of our life is not guaranteed.
Impacting the marketplace with our faith, that we demonstrate that faith every day in what we do, how we do it, that it leaves anybody that we do business with. They leave our presence with a desire to grow closer to God.
Hi everyone, my name is Tessa Needham and I am the Operations Manager for ELO. Welcome to today's webinar, where Peter Legge will be interviewing Rick Goossen on his new book, Public Speaking Laws of Success. This conversation between Peter and Rick will begin shortly. As a reminder, everyone attending this webinar today will receive access to a free ebook version of Rick's new book. Simply fill out our survey at the end of the webinar to receive the ebook. I would now like to introduce Peter Legge. Peter is the chairman and CEO of Canada-wide Media. He has been ranked in the top 20 speakers in North America and has also received ELO's Entrepreneurial Leaders Award. Peter will be interviewing Rick Goossen and hosting our conversation today. Welcome, Peter.
It's good to be here. We're gonna go right into Rick, because in my career as a professional speaker, as you alluded to, I've spoken about 5,000 times on 5 continents, but it's only just recently I've come across a book that I wish I had had many years ago, because I truly believe it would have helped me become a more proficient and effective speaker and communicator. And the title of the book is Public Speaking, The Laws of Success by Rick Goossen, which we are going to talk about in the next few minutes. I wish the book was published when I first started as a professional speaker, because I really don't know how I got on without it. The author today is with us, my good friend, Rick Goossen. Rick, it's good to be here.
Well, Peter, it's really a privilege to be interviewed by someone like yourself who's got so much experience. And, you know, it's interesting, even the comment you make about all the speaking you've done, and of course, you've done a great job for us. But when you talk about, hey, the book, you know, I wish it could have been available before. The interesting thing with public speaking is virtually all great public speakers have no formal training in the field, which in itself is very fascinating. So there's a great opportunity for everyone listening to learn, and just like, you know, you, Peter, you know, you've spoken for so long and learned on the job, as it were. So I think that's a great opportunity for people to think, hey, I can master these skills.
So if you're probably right, I've never really thought about that, but if they haven't had any kind of formal education or books like yours to read or coaching, what causes them to be a public speaker in the first place?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. So what I find quite fascinating is, if you think about this, most people are asked to speak somewhere not because of their ability to speak. They're asked to speak because of who they are or their content. So someone, I've listened to people like a fellow who was an astrophysicist with amazing credentials. He was asked to speak at a function. It was really, really bad. Well, he was asked not because he could speak in public, but just because he was the astrophysicist. Or if you're at a wedding, you're somebody's uncle or you're some relative and you're asked to make some remarks, not because you won't put your foot in your mouth, but because, you know, you're the uncle of the bride.
And you might put your foot in your mouth.
Most likely. So for all of you listening, in the book, I've got a chapter on 4 weddings and a funeral. And I sometimes say to people that there's no greater opportunity for a person to make a fool of themselves than when they're emceeing or speaking at a wedding. It's a deadly combination between lack of ability, fueled by alcohol, and all these circumstances. It's like a Shakespearean witch's brew that can produce the most unintended outcomes.
Well, with you've got a doctorate degree and all kinds of specialist programming that you've taken over the years to be a better leader and administrator and a speaker. What caused you to be a speaker and to learn some of the intricacies to make you a better speaker? Finally, it ended up to being a part of this book, which we'll talk about a little later.
Well, yeah, that's a really great question, because the first opportunities I had to speak in public really came from family gatherings and from church settings. And I think if you're open-minded, you get put in a situation where you're expected to speak in front of people. And then I think early on, we all make this decision that, am I going to try to do a good job and therefore keep getting opportunities and learning, or will I wilt and say, no, I'm no good at public speaking, I won't do it. So I resolved early on that this is an important skill for me to have. And like a lot of things in life, you're only going to improve by actually doing it. It's like learning a language. You know, we aren't born being able to speak a second language perfectly. So if you're going to learn a second language, you have to accept the fact that you will make lots and lots of mistakes, et cetera, but you resolve to learn. So I think with public speaking, it's a similar thing. I just resolved early on that this is important. I need to know how to do it well. And so every opportunity that there is, I'll grab it and get the experience.
Can you remember your first speech and where it was and how you did?
I can. My first more formal speech or presentation was actually doing a sermon at the church I grew up in. And it was interesting because, you know, when you're at that point, I was in my early 20s, and it's a little bit of you don't know what you don't know. So it was probably okay. I say okay in a qualified sense. And in fact, I even have a recording of it, but I'm too embarrassed to listen to it. So I think it was, you know, so what I would say is, if you follow, for anyone listening, any presentation opportunity you've got, if you follow a structure, there's a limit to how bad it can be. So I say in the book, you will be better than 90% of all public speakers you ever hear if you follow some basic parameters. So I think my first presentation, it wasn't great, but I think it wasn't bad in the sense of I had a sense of structure.
You've probably heard this line. I didn't write it. I wish I had it. If you're asked to speak at a funeral, say, I've had most people say, I'd rather be in the coffin than giving the funeral speech.
Right.
I understand that. I understand that.
Well,
So,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, because one of the examples I give in the book, I talk about the laws of success, 4 weddings and a funeral. And I was at a funeral, and it was very unfortunate because the people were there gathered to honor the dearly departed, their grandmother. And that's what the funeral was about. And so a pastor got up to provide the remarks, and he said, well, the grandmother was a very wonderful lady. And in fact, she reminds me of my grandmother. And in fact, my grandmother, and then he spoke for the entire time about his grandmother at the funeral of someone else's grandmother. So it was completely inappropriate. And so I know, Peter, we've discussed this in the past when you've done our events, that the fundamental starting point is, what's the purpose? And now it sounds so basic, but you know, so for anyone listening, if you were speaking at a funeral, doing a eulogy or providing some remarks, the number one question is, what's the purpose? It's not about you. Nobody cares about you. The purpose is you're honoring the person who departed and allow them to do so in dignity. So the focus of this pastor should have been, regardless of his grandmother, that doesn't matter. The focus is on your grandmother and what a person she was. That's why everybody's there. So, you know, the rules and laws of public speaking, the basic principles, these 50 laws, they apply, as I say in the subtitle, to all people, all occasions. It's the same laws that will help someone be successful, whether delivering a sermon, a eulogy, or a business presentation.
What do you think goes on in a person's body or mind when it's their first speech and they've said, yes, I'll do whatever the speech is, whatever the presentation is? Why is it that as it gets closer to, say, 12 noon, when you're doing what you've agreed to do, and it might only be 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, why do most people get so nervous and crumble, and invariably it destroys their message? What do you think happens?
Well, I think, unfortunately, people think, will I trip on the way up? Will I stumble? Will I, you know, on and on and on. So I think people get justifiably nervous, you know, which is fine, but I think it's really a bit of a mental game. So, you know, I used to be like that too. I think everybody's like that when they start off, but I think the way you snuff that out of your psyche is, if you're well prepared and focused, then you'll do just fine. So well prepared meaning, you know why you're there, what you're supposed to deliver, what you're supposed to do, very clear, you've prepared, and you're focused on that. And then the the nervousness that you have to channel that into positive energy. So when I speak anywhere, I always so as it gets closer, I get really, really excited. I almost get too amped up because I'm thinking, this is the moment I've been waiting for. Like I literally want to run out on stage because I think this is just phenomenal. This is so much fun. This is great. So any nervousness or any sort of negativity, I just channel that into, like, this is going to be great. And I think that's the point you have to get to, where it's not something to be dreaded. It's you have to. So a lot of speakers have said to me, what they try to accomplish, I know for pastors and lots of people, they'll say, the opportunity to influence and impact somebody, I have to bring my best. And this is exciting because I can be a vessel to actually impact somebody in a positive way. And that's exciting. So that's, I think, the mindset we have to get to.
Yeah, I think you're right. My experience says to me that those people who, it could be their first or second or maybe 10th or 15th speech, but they don't do it very often, are so consumed with themselves and that they forget there's a couple of hundred people out there that are anticipating what he or she may say. And so they want to do a good job really for themselves, which they'll do ultimately. But they get so caught up with that, they forget the message needs to be given, what they're trying to do, who is the audience, who's in the audience, what have they been asked to do, and they forget that, and they concentrate so much on themselves that they forget the audience. Have you experienced that, or do you see that very often?
Well, I think, I think that's a great point, because I think people can get self-absorbed with themselves, but I think it's a bit of a mentality shift in that when you're speaking somewhere, I think you have to have some basic humility that, I'm prepared, I'm going to do my best. I'm not the greatest in the world. I'm probably not the worst, but I'm going to do my best. And that's what I'm offering. And I hope to impact people. And this idea of, I think when people get really self-absorbed and nervous is if they start to think too much of the secondary items. Like if they think, oh, there's this person in the audience. What will these people think? You know, my boss is there, my family's there. You know, important people, so-called important people are there. What if I mess up? All these things. But you know what? I think it's the same probably for any athlete, any performer. You know, you can't get absorbed in those peripheral items. I think again, it's a matter of focus. You're there, just do the job, do a great job on the presentation, and all those secondary things, they'll take care of themselves.
So I know some of this is in the book, which incidentally is an absolutely excellent read. I don't care how long you've been in the speaking business. I've been in it a long time, but I devoured the contents of this book. And many of them I could relate to, mistakes that I've made, I wish I hadn't have made, but I did. What is the number one biggest mistake a new speaker makes?
Wow. I mean, in the book, I cover, you know, I cover a lot of things that can go wrong, what can go well. But I'd say, you know, probably the biggest mistake is not having a clear hook right at the beginning. So one of the dangerous things in public speaking is most people will assess you in the first 15 seconds, maximum 1 minute. So if you think virtually anytime you speak in public, we all do this instinctively. You know, you're sitting there, so-and-so is introduced, they go to the front, and you're thinking in your mind, is this person worth listening to? It sounds very cruel, but that's basically it. So people will either tune in or tune out in the first minute. And so for any new speaker, they have to think carefully, how will I get people's attention right from the get-go? Like what can I say to sort of hook them? You know, something interesting, an interesting fact, an interesting story, some interesting twist. You know, what can I do to get their attention? So I would say that. The other thing I'd mention related to that is a big mistake that, let's say, inexperienced public speakers may make is that public speaking is an art form. It's not, you know, public reading is not public speaking. Written communication is very different than verbal communication. So you don't write it on paper, read it out. That's a complete misunderstanding of the nature of public speaking. Public speaking is an art form. You're trying to communicate and communicate clearly. So just to give you a simple example, if you listen to Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, he says, "I have a dream" 9 times. And if you watch him, to this day, when I watch that speech, I get shivers down my spine. It's one of the most incredible speeches of all time when he's saying, "I have a dream," and he goes on and on. Well, I've read that entire speech. When you read this speech, it has no impact. In fact, it seems rather repetitious. He keeps saying the same thing. And yet in a verbal form, it's very different. So key thing for people starting off is to realize you have to get people's attention immediately, and you have to realize speaking is very, very different than writing. Speaking is an art form. It's a form of communication that requires very different techniques and strategies than something in written form.
So I know it's in the book. Give me a couple of examples from your history of organizations you've spoken to, how you might open in your early days of speaking. What would you actually say?
Well, I think in my early days of speaking, I probably was far too factual. "Hi, my name is Rick. I will be speaking about, you know, how to ride a bicycle. Here's 3 ways you can ride a bicycle. 1, 2, 3. And it's very, very, you know, mechanical. But see, what you'd want to start off with. So I'll give you an example, something that just occurred to me the other day. So we do presentations on will and estate planning. So people planning their affairs. So I just finished reading a book on Einstein. So I would start off a presentation by saying, are you aware that when Albert Einstein maybe the greatest mind of the last 100 or 200 years, when he passed away, the person doing the autopsy took his brain. Can you believe it? There was a doctor in Princeton. He did the autopsy on Albert Einstein and took his brain. This fellow had Albert Einstein's brain in his house in a formaldehyde jar. Wow. And he said to Albert Einstein's son, hey, you know, this would be really great for research. Do you mind if I take it? And Albert Einstein's only son, who was there, didn't really know any better and said, well, I guess so. So this fellow, for the rest of his life, had Albert Einstein's brain in various places, like on his mantle, in the back of his Chevy, on and on. Now, I would say, so the point of that is when you do your will and estate planning, be very, very specific. So in this case, Albert Einstein's wishes were not honored, not adhered to by his son. So when you do your planning, you got to be very, very careful. Now, when I read that story, I had never heard this before. So there's a great book by Walter Isaacson on Einstein. And his last chapter is titled Einstein's Mind and Einstein's Brain. And to imagine that this famous individual, they took his brain. So, I mean, they took his brain. Can you imagine? You're driving around. What's in the back seat? Oh, that's Albert Einstein's brain over there. I mean, this is
without even asking.
Yeah, he didn't, you know, and I'm sure Albert Einstein, if he knew that, would not be too pleased.
He'd come back and say, I want my brain back, please.
Yeah, you know, so this is just an interesting example. If you started off a presentation, and I know I'd also add, a lot of times, and we've talked about this, when you start off a presentation, don't repeat the obvious. So if I introduce, or if I'm introduced and people say, well, this is Rick Goossen, et cetera, I should not get up and say, well, my name is Rick Goossen and I will be speaking about this. Everybody will be thinking, well, we just heard that a second ago. So you're going to lose people. So one of the great ways to start off, and this is in the book, you start off by, you just walk right up and you say, let me take you back to 1985 in Hong Kong. I had just arrived, fresh out of law school. The smell of money was in the air. And I thought, how will I get a job? I had 30 days before my money would run out. As soon as I got out of the airport to the flat I was renting, I started my quest. It was a big challenge, you know, and you go on from there. But you know, how do we learn? We learn through stories. So for anyone who's a pastor or any communicator, you know, that story, you know, the story is key, because we all learn through stories, and we always want to know, how does a story end? You know how often speakers will start a story at the beginning, and then they won't give you the ending. And then they'll, of course, they're stringing you along. So right when they get to the conclusion, oh, and by the way, this is who killed so-and-so or whatever.
That's a very excellent opening. I modify mine this way. Once I'm introduced by whomever, come up on stage, depending what, do I shake his hands or her hands? We'll get all that out. You got to do that quickly and effectively. Then I come to the microphone, and I haven't said anything yet, but I would open with this. Come back with me 10 years. Now, I don't know what's gonna follow that, but that could be almost any speech. Let me take you back 10 years. And then I pause. And then I've got to interject something there that relates to the audience or the message or the theme or the what have you. But those are my very first words. Let me take you back, right off the bat. I find that snaps them to attention, because they're thinking, well, he's going to reintroduce himself. He's going to say he's from Vancouver. He had a difficult flight getting in here or whatever it is like that. That works for me.
Well, what I find too, that speakers sometimes make this mistake of, so if we think of the 1-minute test, so sometimes speakers make the mistake of, they'll walk up to the podium and then they'll be shuffling their papers and say, well, yeah, it's good to be here. Yeah, I'm pleased to be here. So just let me get organized. Oh yeah, I got my papers here. So sometimes when a speaker starts off, you think to yourself, had you not thought what you were going to say
Yeah.
before you got to the podium? Like, had that not occurred to you? What will I say? So for everybody listening, the key thing is, a lot of individuals will say, have the first minute not memorized in the sense of you're an automaton spewing out words, but rather be very clear. As soon as you walk up to the podium, look up, let me take you back. And then, because I know, Peter, when you've done this, I know the audience snaps to attention. Or if you walked up and said, were you aware of what happened to Einstein's brain? The most famous brain of the last couple hundred years was taken from him without his wishes being honored, against the wishes really of his son, and ended up being shopped around for the next 25 years. How does that happen?
Yeah.
I'd never, I read this 550-page book on Einstein. I'd never heard that before. It's a story, Einstein's brain.
Yeah. I would probably start that. No, I'm not going to, obviously. I'd probably start that with, I'd have to figure out the date that happened. That would be part of it. But I'd start out with, let me take you back to December the 18th, 1850, or whatever it was, right? This is what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get the retention again that way. It works for me. It might not work for other people, but it's something that I like to do, and it snaps them to attention because they don't have 2 seconds to think about what I'm going to say. Bang, you're into it right away, gently and calmly, and you're not yelling at them and what have you. When did you decide to write this book? Because writing a book is relatively difficult, but a book like this, because it goes sometimes from the beginning of a person's desire to be a speaker, all through some of the difficulties and the what to do's and what not to do's. How long did it take you to write this book? And when did you start? When did you come up with the whole idea of, I need to do a book on public speaking to help people who speak at your events and do some of the mess ups that you talk about?
Right. Well, I think I've done a lot of speaking over the years in different contexts, and then being part of ELO, working with top speakers, I saw a lot of great speakers in action. And of course, I'd see all the things that could go wrong. And what really motivated me was, and I think it's a frustration that maybe a lot of us will feel, when you see something that could be done better, but isn't, and it could be easily remedied. So that frustrated me. So I taught at a university for a while. I probably had 1,000 students come through, and part of what they were taught was presentation skills. And I could see how much of a difference some basic training would make to people's effectiveness. And so the motivation for the book is really trying to be helpful, trying to collate these stories that these situations I've experienced over the years, and to have something that would be helpful, and something that I didn't see in the market. So, it's not a book going back to Aristotle's rhetoric and the theories of public speaking. No, this is very, very practical. It can be read in 2-3 hours, and it can really help make a difference. And so what really prompted me was, like, as an example, there's these really basic things that sometimes people don't think about. So if I mention to everyone listening, do you think it's a good idea to insult the audience you're speaking to? I think most people would say, well, that's almost a stupid question. Who would do that? You mean you get up? Do you think it's a good idea to get up and insult the organizer and your audience? I think all of us would say, well, obviously not. Now, how many times have I seen and heard that happen? So many I can't even count. I've been at weddings where, the MC will say, oh, this side of the family's from, we won't mention the place, somewhere in a different part of Canada. Oh, you bunch of nincompoops and imbeciles and rhubarbs, who would want to live in that place? And yuckity yuck yuck, it's glad that you're here in this part of the country. And then proceed to think it's quite amusing to basically insult half the attendees at the wedding the entire time. Or when I've organized events, now a professional speaker will focus on what's the purpose. It's I get up there, my goal is to deliver a good presentation. But I've had people at events I've organized, and of course, a lot of people in the audience are friends of mine, and I'll have a speaker get up, and the first thing you'll say is, well, you know what? Rick invited me, but didn't give me enough time. Rick should have given me more time. Bad Rick, didn't give me enough time. I wish Rick would have given me more time. I'm thinking, okay, that's like going to somebody's, that's like me going to your place. Well, Peter, thanks for inviting me over for dinner. I'm really glad to be at your house. But you know what? It should have been a lot sooner. You know, thanks, it's about time. The food doesn't actually smell that good. You know, frankly, we should have had better company. And I proceed to insult you for having invited me over to your place for dinner. I suspect that might be the last time I'm at your place for dinner. And so these speakers I've had who do that, you know, the fundamental thing to think about is when you're speaking somewhere, it's not about you. It's not about insulting other people. You're there to, you know, what's the purpose? You know, if you're emceeing a wedding, so just think about this. How many times have you been at a wedding where the MC thinks it's about them rather than the couple? So that's what I find so comical about weddings, because often the person who's MC, it's their first moment of glory. It's their first opportunity in prime time. And then it becomes all about them. No, the reality is if you're emceeing a wedding, you're facilitating the experience for the bride and groom, right? So that's what it's about. So I think that's a critical thing to remember.
Do you think that speaker, using what you opened this little session with, understands what he or she is doing, or is it a bit of nerves, or they think it's clever to say? What causes them to do that?
Well, I think it's actually a lack of thought, which now it seems so obvious, but you know, a number of the laws I discuss in the book, I've asked myself over the years, you know, why would someone do that? But I think what happens is people haven't thought carefully about this idea that you are there to facilitate someone else's event. So just, you know, it's a real basic aspect of our human personality. So if you've been invited to do something at another event, so for example, the great speakers at our events, like Peter, like you do whenever you speak at our event, it's you always ask, Rick, what can I do to help your event be successful? That's the question. Not, hey, I'm here. I'm basically the star. I'll talk as long as I want. So I think people just don't think about it. I'll give you a great example from a wedding. So the couple was getting married and they wanted a toast to the bride and a toast to the groom. And each of the couple were to pick a family member. So the groom selected his aunt. Aunt gets up there, does 3 to 4 minutes exactly as instructed, did a phenomenal job, you know, toast to the groom, my little nephew, okay, it's all good. Then the fellow gets up there for the toast to the bride. So now, and you think, okay, what's the purpose? It's a toast to the bride. He was told 3 to 4 minutes. You have an entire choreographed event and wedding, and you have the meal that's been prepared and everybody waiting, and it's going to be a long day, you know, on and on and on. So the fellow shuffles up to the podium and he's about to start the toast to the bride. He starts off with those fateful words that struck fear into the hearts of almost everybody. Joe and I first met in 1952. What? Joe is the father of the bride. And this was, you know, the good friend of Joe, the father. Well, he started in 1951. It took him 10 minutes to get through 1951. Then we were on to 1952. Then 1953. You know, it went on for 40 minutes. 40 minutes. I mean, it was almost comical. The servers were holding the trays of food. Rigor mortis was setting in. Finally, they conceded defeat. They threw up the white flag. They retreated, with their tails between their legs to the kitchen. So that toast threw off the entire event. Then the event ended up going on 40 minutes late. People were getting impatient. People had to drive back from whence they came, et cetera, et cetera. Now you could ask yourself, it was pretty straightforward. You are doing a toast to the bride, a few nice comments about the bride. I remember when she was a little kid and she looks so wonderful today, and here's to the bride. But this person viewed it as a bit of a very lengthy summary of his relationship with the father of the bride. What possessed that person? Who knows? That was maybe his one and only opportunity. He did not get a repeat opportunity.
So it sounds to me, what I hear you saying here, which is a very good point, that you might not ever be a professional speaker. You may only do half a dozen speeches in your life, but the importance of preparation, of how long you've got to speak, what to know what your subject matter is, if you're toasting the bride or whatever it is as important for someone who only does half a dozen in his lifetime to someone who does half a dozen in a week.
Yeah, well, and that's a great point, because like the book is for people who do a lot of speaking and people who do very little speaking, because I would say if you master those 50 laws and even just some of the basics. So I would say to do a good presentation, if you just understand what's the purpose of the talk, how long should I go? Okay, so now I'm doing a toast, I got 4 minutes. Okay, what can I possibly say within that time? Then you have to have, and this to me is always a key thing, you have to have symmetry or structure to your presentation. So if you were doing a 30-minute presentation, you could say, well, okay, I need 3 minutes for the introduction, 3 minutes for the conclusion. That gives me 24 minutes in the middle. I've got maybe 3 points. Okay, that's 8 minutes per point. That allows me to explain each point, give an example, then allows me to tie the whole thing together. So you need the structure and what I call symmetry, because you'll often notice when people speak in public, if, sometimes a person will start talking, they'll say, hey, I want to explain these 3 points. And then you look and the person has spent 50 or 60% of their time explaining the first point. Well, what's happened is they haven't planned properly. They've taken too long to explain their examples, and then they get a misshapen beast, which is the presentation. So then the way I imagine it in my mind is you spend 15 minutes on the first point, 10 minutes on the second point, and like 2 minutes on the last point. And then it ruins the symmetry. Also for a presentation, you have to think you need to balance the introduction and conclusion. So one common mistake is people take too long on their introduction. So if you've got a 30-minute presentation, you don't have a 10-minute introduction. You have to be very clear. Okay, the hook, here's something interesting. Here's what I'm talking about it. Let's get to it. Because sometimes when you hear a person talk and then their opening story is too long, people start to think, what's the point of this? Like, what are we covering off here? So again, remember, if you have a 30-minute presentation, 3 minutes on the introduction, 3 minutes on the conclusion, not 5, 6, 7 minutes on the introduction, because you're going to lose people, because people want to be hooked in and then understand, what are we covering?
So, okay, we've talked about that. Help me understand one of the best or 2 or 3 best ways to bring your presentation to the conclusion.
Oh, that's a really good question. So I would say the conclusion in some ways should be self-evident. That's one thing. So meaning that if you watch a good movie has got momentum heading towards the close. A bad movie will go on for 90 minutes and then all of a sudden it's over. And you wonder what that's it? Every good movie, it always reaches a denouement, like a great crescendo where it all comes together. So your conclusion, a good conclusion, is really set up over the previous 30 minutes of your presentation. And the conclusion ideally is like an exclamation point. So it brings things together. It clarifies the main point of what you've discussed. So if you started off with, here's the story, here's what I want to get across, here's my main point. Then you go through the three supporting points. Then you conclude with, and that's why this is important. And then you give some new twist, some way of bringing it together. And then with that exclamation point. So it really needs to tie in. So a good conclusion should not be distracting where people think, okay, he or she was talking about something going in a certain direction. And then at the end, there's something out of left field, like some random quote. No, it should all weave together where people go, wow, it's like a Shakespearean play. You know how with Shakespeare plays, so many, like Romeo and Juliet, at the end, it all comes together. So when the play's over, you go, okay, that's a wrap. We now understand the Montagues and Capulets, and we understand Romeo and Juliet, and we understand this, a lot better. There's nothing more to say. So the conclusion should really tie the strings together, ideally with an exclamation point.
Are stories important in a person's presentation, and if so, why?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I found is like stories are key. So the 50 public speaking laws is basically 50 stories. And, we often think, I listen to somebody speak, I don't remember what they talked about, but I remember the story. And so we all learn. And so Peter, with the times you've spoken for us, I mean, I've heard you tell certain stories and I could repeat them not as well, but I remember those stories. So we all learn through stories. But I would say one of the dangers that I've seen time and time again is the story overwhelms the actual presentation. So what happens is you get an unfocused presentation without good structure and symmetry, but the person told one really interesting, possibly too long story. So then you remember the story, but you don't remember other things. Also, one of the challenges is that, and this is where I've seen this mistake made over and over, where the story, while it's interesting and fascinating, has nothing to do with the main point, or it doesn't tie in well enough with the main point. So often I think speakers think, hey, that's a really good story, but it's not really on point. So what happens is people listen to the story and then they think, okay, how does that tie into the main thrust? So at the end of it, at the end of your presentation, what do you want people to remember? You want them to remember your thesis, the thrust, not because the story. So think of it this way, for everyone listening, think of a story as a method of emphasizing a key point. So the story is not the end. The story is a means to an end. The end is to deliver a clear message. The story just helps you get there. But anytime people remember only the story, then they've just remembered one of your techniques or methods of explaining something, but they actually haven't retained your core message.
So where does the speaker get their stories from?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And how do they record them for posterity where they can pick and choose when they're going to use these stories?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So what I found is all of us have interesting things happen to us. And sometimes, it's worth actually just scribbling down a few notes if something very unique happens to you. So I find when you're doing a presentation, so for everyone listening, it's much better to focus on what are my own stories? What story can I share where it's something that's happened to me, not from an egotistical standpoint, but just something, something that I've experienced that other people can relate to. Because once you start thinking, well, my stories aren't that interesting, but I heard about somebody else's story. Well, when you get up there and start talking about, sharing what we'd call a canned story, well, then you're not original. Then you're not unique. It's like hearsay. You're just passing on someone else's story. Like, for example, like Peter, if I told your story about the time you ran that race, in England, and how you're rounding the corner and you saw your parents and grandparents and they were cheering you on. Well, Yeah, I can say that, but that's secondhand. I mean, you're the one to tell your story. So I think for, especially when you're starting off, we all have interesting stories. And the good thing is, if you tell your own story, then it's easier to remember, obviously, and you can tell it with more emotion. So sometimes when people speak in public, they're concerned about, forgetting things, right? Like, how will I remember exactly what happened? But if it's your story, something happened to me in elementary school or high school, and man, I couldn't believe this. And well, you're sharing your experience. You're not going to forget that.
Yeah, I've got a story that I've only told a couple of times. When I was interviewing David Foster in Victoria for another event, and he was asked to speak to the students at the University of Victoria. And so I thought, well, I'll go out and just listen to him and see what he says. And he had a little piano in front of him, and he was playing the piano and doing all this stuff, because that's where he started, as you probably know, in Victoria. And at the end of his presentation, and I deal with that, at the end of his presentation, there's a young, attractive woman sitting in the front row. And she said to David, she said, "Mr. Foster, I wish you could have heard my sister, could have heard you today." So he shot back, "Why? And where does she live? And why isn't she here?" "Well, she's a speaker and she lives in Toronto." "Then why didn't you fly her out here last night on a red eye, have her sit in the front row and ask me that question?" Because it's expensive. You've got to learn to sacrifice to be successful in this business. She wants to be a pianist or she wants to be a musician. You've got to sacrifice. It's not easy. That's what you've got to do. That was his answer. So I tell that story.
Yeah.
And we're thinking about talking to graduates, right? I'm saying these 4 years that you're in the middle of here, you're going to have to continue sacrificing to graduate in whenever you're going to graduate in a couple of years, because it's going to take a lot of your time and energy and sweat and tears to do that if you don't sacrifice.
Yeah. Hey, Peter, as you were talking, I just looked at one of the questions, and it's from a friend of mine who's a pastor. So he asked about humor. And I think this is a great question, because just to mention to everyone, one of the best joke tellers I've ever heard is Peter Legge. And it was interesting because before I got to know Peter better, I'd heard you speak various places, and I thought, wow, this guy has got an amazing ability to tell a joke and his sense of timing. Well, then as I got to know you, I found out, you've spoken for so many years, but you were actually a stand-up comedian originally. So just to answer that question, how do you use humor effectively? So one of the chapters in the book is titled "Humor is No Joke." So what I would advise people, and what I put in the book, is that if you want to be funny, that's a very big challenge. So if you want to be deliberately funny, so I would say, one, never tell a canned joke. You have to be extremely good, and it's extremely high risk to start off a presentation by saying, there was 3 guys walking along. One guy had a limp, the other guy had one eye, and the other guy was, blind or whatever. Then they met a talking donkey, and the donkey said to them, and you're thinking, oh my, like this is right out of like the volume of Jokes 101, how to be a funny presenter. That's really, really bad. I've seen people try that, and then they stop for the punchline, they wait for the laughs, and there's this deathly silence. So I advise people, like, unless you're Peter Legge, which most of us are not, and you've been speaking for 50 years and you're trained as a stand-up comedian, then I'd say don't try telling like a deliberate joke. You can be a great speaker without trying to tell a deliberate joke. At the same time, I distinguish between humor and telling a joke. So humor can be humorous situations. Hey, here's what happened to me as, I was doing X, Y, Z, and here's something that happened. You explain it, and if people think it's funny, they laugh, but otherwise you just keep going on with your presentation. So you can be humorous, but sometimes people think, especially when they're starting off, they think, okay, I need to be funny. So I'll buy a book on 101 jokes and I will now be funny. That's a really bad idea. So I think the main encouragement to people is you don't need to tell a joke in order to be a great speaker. The other thing I'd say in terms of the risk, people have very differing views of humor. And I'll just tie it in with one thing we discussed before, Peter, this one chapter, the most dangerous 15 seconds in any presentation. So sometimes when people ad lib, that's when they tell jokes, they think it's funny and they misspeak. So I've been at many events where I've heard the speaker say something that is, you could say misogynist, borderline racist, completely inappropriate, on and on. And now you may think to yourself, what, really? Yeah, you'd be surprised what comes out of somebody's mouth when they're standing on a podium and they think it's funny. We have no idea what possesses somebody. So that's what can happen. So I think it's good for especially when you're starting off, just try to stay away from any canned joke, anything that could be in any way offensive. You know, you can be humorous through your, and last point I make is nobody can argue with self-deprecating humor. I'd say to people, if you want to make fun of somebody, make fun of yourself. You can't go wrong. Can't go wrong doing that, right? Don't make fun of other people. Why? You're just leaving yourself open to too much risk.
I notice there's a lot of questions, Rick, on the screen. Do you want to answer those, or?
Yeah, I'll just see what else there is. Okay, so here's, who was your best mentor in making you a good speaker? So I don't know if Peter, if you want to, because I know you've had different mentors. Like who would you say is a mentor for you?
Well, the last 20 years, I've been a member of the Speakers Roundtable, which is an invitation-only society headquartered in the States, and I'm the only Canadian that's a member of that. And so those speakers are absolutely excellent. And when we do our conventions, we do a convention in the summer, and then we get together after New Year's. And everyone gets a turn at the lectern to do what has worked for them this year. Mm-hmm. So many of those people, Nito Cobain, who was the president of High Point College in North Carolina, is an absolutely superb speaker. And I don't speak like him, but I learn from his phrasing, his dynamism, and how he pieces his things together, primarily for the university. Yeah. But it appeals to the audience.
Yeah.
Then I've got another one here it says, how do you use humor effectively? Well, I think you've dealt with that. Mm-hmm. Sarah says, how do you deal with extreme stage fright? And have you made a speech work, etc.? The only time my very first speech was at Vincent Massey, which is in New Westminster. It was at the Massey Theater when I was graduating from junior high to senior high. And I was asked to do the convocation. And I had no idea what I said yes to, but I said yes. It was scary, but I didn't know what I was doing, but I prepared, and I thought, I'm gonna do this. I put it into 3 parts, and but I didn't have stage fright. But nobody really knows, unless you're shaking, that you're as nervous as you think you are. Mm-hmm. They don't know. They really don't care. Mm-hmm. You care that you're nervous, but they don't. They just want to hear what you've got to say about your topic, about your life, about your experiences, how you failed. People like to know how you failed, mm-hmm. what has gone wrong in your life, and how do you modify and correct that. Right. So that's how I think you can deal with stage fright.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, I see, believe it or not, it's already 5 minutes to 1, and we were going to wrap up at this point and pass it over to Tessa. And Tessa will talk about how everyone listening can get a copy of the ebook. So Tessa, do you want to join us?
Hi, everybody. Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Rick, for your time. This was a great hour-long conversation. Just as we end the webinar, a survey will pop up. We would love your feedback. We always want to make the ELO webinars better, as most valuable as we can for all of our attendees. So yeah, once you complete the survey, it'll ask you if you'd like to receive a copy of the ebook. And so if you click yes there, then we'll be able to send you one. Yeah, thanks again, Peter and Rick, and goodbye, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Peter. Enjoyed it.